All right, let's just jump right into it. Can a computer actually simulate a human brain? It's a question that sits right at the absolute zenith of modern computational theory, neurobiology, and material science. In today's explainer, we're going to look at whether whole brain emulation, what's often called in silico neuroscience, is actually becoming a scientific reality or if it's just stuck in the realm of science fiction. The answer is incredibly complex, and getting there requires us to totally rethink how computation even works. So let's get started. Okay, let's dive into this, because it really is the ultimate sci-fi dream, right? Can we map our consciousness, our memories, our actual identities, and just upload our minds to a machine? Well, to answer that, we have to face a massive expectations-subverting reality check about the hardware we've built today versus the incredibly optimized biological hardware sitting inside your skull right now. Just think about this stark David versus Goliath energy chasm. On one hand, you have the human brain. It operates as this ultra-dense, massively parallel network of 86 billion neurons. And the power it needs to do all of that? About 20 watts. That's literally the energy you get from eating a sandwich. On the other hand, you've got the state-of-the-art Frontier Exascale supercomputer. Now, it boasts 9.2 petabytes of memory and can theoretically simulate maybe 1% of a human brain, and even then only at a fraction of biological speed. But it requires 21 million watts of power. We are literally comparing biological wetware running on a sandwich to a machine that needs a small nuclear reactor's worth of power just to turn on. So how did we even get here? Let's take a really brisk walk through the history of computational neuroscience. It's fascinating because we started with pure math and had to move to massive hardware. Back in 1952, the Hodgkin-Huxley model gave us the baseline differential equations for how neurons fire. Super accurate, but computationally exhausting. So, moving into the 1960s, scientists came up with abstracted models like the Loihi integrate and fire, which basically simplified the math so we could run larger simulations. Fast forward to 2005, and the Blue Brain project fired up massive supercomputers to successfully reverse engineer parts of a rat's brain. But standard software simulations eventually hit a physical brick wall, and that ushered in the neuromorphic era in 2014. Scientists realized, hey, we can't just write better software anymore. We actually have to physically build chips that behave like biology. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the core reason our standard computers struggle so much. It all comes down to the von Neumann bottleneck. Honestly, think of this like a terrible, energy-wasting daily commute. In a normal computer, your processor, the CPU or GPU, is physically totally separate from your memory, your RAM. So every single time a computation happens, data has to be fetched from memory, driven down a system bus, processed, and then driven all the way back. For a network of 86 billion neurons, this constant back and forth memory fetching creates a catastrophic traffic jam. It chokes your bandwidth and generates just an immense amount of heat. So how exactly does biology avoid this nightmare commute? By entirely reinventing the architecture. Conventional von Neumann architecture relies on those separated units and these really rigid synchronous global clocks. Neuromorphic architecture, though, mimics biology through what's called in-memory computing. In your brain, and in these new neuromorphic chips, the processing and memory are co-located. The synapse itself acts as the memory storage and the processing conduit at the exact same time. Plus, instead of a global clock constantly taking away and drawing power, it uses asynchronous spiking neural networks, meaning the system only consumes energy when a specific discrete event, a spike, actually happens. This drastically cuts down on idle power. So the crucial point is this staggering number, 10 to the negative 14th power. That is the exact fraction of a single joule of energy that a human brain uses per synaptic event. It's an almost incomprehensible level of efficiency. And quite frankly, it is the ultimate benchmark that all computational neuroscientists are desperately trying to chase. To put that into perspective, let's quantify this massive efficiency gap. The human brain is our baseline, 10 to the negative 14th joules. Now, look at the cutting-edge Intel Loihi 2 neuromorphic chip. Even though it's literally designed to mimic the brain, it is still 1,000 times less efficient than biology. And traditional AI hardware, an NVIDIA H100 GPU running artificial neural networks, uses 10 to the negative 9th joules. That's 100,000 times less efficient. And here's the kicker. Even if we could somehow network 86,000 Loihi chips together to match a human's neuron count, the sheer routing congestion across all those separate chips would create absolutely insurmountable latency. Which brings us to what I like to call the rule of 4. Think of this as a mental checklist of the exact, totally insurmountable reality checks preventing whole brain emulation right now. To simulate a brain, you have to overcome the connectome deficit, the interconnect wall, glial cell complexity, and thermal dissipation. Let's break each of these down so you can see exactly what stands in our way. First up, the connectome deficit. A connectome is essentially the biological wiring diagram of the brain. It's a comprehensive map of every single neural connection you have. Obviously, before you can simulate a brain, you gotta know how it's wired, right? Well, the problem is the sheer epistemological impossibility of mapping a human brain, which contains up to 100 trillion synapses. Just to put the absolute absurdity of this scale into perspective, humanity has only fully mapped the connectome of a tiny nematode worm with exactly 302 neurons and a fruit fly larva with about 3,000 neurons. That is it. To map the 100 trillion synapses of a human using current electron microscopy, we would literally need exabytes of data. It would take centuries of processing time just to read the map. Okay, moving to the second bottleneck, the interconnect wall. This is a fundamental hardware issue. Biological brains exist in a full 3D volume, and that allows for massive hyperconnectivity. A single neuron can reach out in three-dimensional space and connect to 10,000 others. But our silicon chips, they're flat. They are essentially 2.5-dimensional planar substrates. If you try to force that 3D biological wiring density onto a flat 2D silicon chip, the wires just have to get longer and longer to reach everything. And that results in exponential wire delay, massive routing congestion, and huge power dissipation. And this brilliantly illustrates our third bottleneck. The brain is way more than just electrical wiring. Early computer models kind of assumed only neurons did the actual computing. But modern neuroscience shows us that glial cells, like astrocytes, actually dynamically modulate memory. Plus, global neuromodulators, like dopamine and serotonin, they don't travel on distinct little wires. They operate via volumetric fluid diffusion, using chemical gradients. Simulating complex volumetric fluid dynamics on top of billions of electrical spikes, that creates an absolute computational overload for our current systems. Which leads us to bottleneck number 4, thermal dissipation. We gotta come back to this massive number, the 21 million watts of heat a supercomputer generates. Silicon systems rely on forced air or heavy liquid cooling plates. If you packed enough processors together to match biological synapse counts, the resulting supercomputer would generate heat comparable to an actual nuclear reactor. It would literally melt its own microarchitectures. Meanwhile, your human brain uses this incredibly elegant, built-in fluid cooling system via cerebrospinal fluid to maintain that cool 20-watt threshold. Let's move to section 2, the future horizon, beyond standard silicon, and see how this builds into something truly revolutionary. We've seen the totally insurmountable limits of our current reality, but science obviously never stops. Overcoming these bottlenecks means we have to abandon standard logic entirely. Let's pivot and look at the state-of-the-art, sci-fi horizon that researchers are actively developing today. Here is the necessary path forward to overcome those catastrophic energy and bandwidth inefficiencies of standard CMOS silicon. We are looking at 4 massive paradigm shifts: memristor crossbar arrays for analog memory, photonic neural networks that compute with actual light to bypass the interconnect wall, wetware computing that utilizes living biology, and finally, quantum integration to model subcellular molecular dynamics. Let's start with memristors. A memristor, or memory resistor, is this amazing nanoscale component whose electrical resistance literally changes based on the history of the voltage applied to it. In other words, it remembers what happened to it. This perfectly mirrors biological synaptic plasticity, the exact way our brain connections strengthen or weaken as we learn. Future chips are going to stack these memristors into dense 3D crossbar arrays, achieving analog operations in a single cycle at near zero power. It basically bypasses the von Neumann bottleneck entirely. But what if instead of mimicking biology, we just used biology? This is where it gets absolutely wild. Startups like Cortical Labs are developing systems they call dish brain. They are literally cultivating living human cortical neurons directly onto high-density multi-electrode arrays. And you know what? It works. They actually taught this petri dish of living brain cells how to play the video game Pong faster than AI could learn it. Instead of trying to simulate a brain with silicon, this paradigm harnesses actual biological tissue, wetware, as the processing unit itself, interfacing it with digital inputs to natively solve machine learning tasks. So as we wrap up our explainer today, we can definitively answer our core question. Can a computer simulate a full human brain right now? No way. As the research emphatically concludes, the traditional von Neumann architecture is an absolute dead end for this specific pursuit. The gap in thermodynamics, hardware topology, and mapping the connectome is just too colossal. Standard architecture simply cannot achieve whole brain emulation. Until we completely master exotic architectures like dense 3D memristors, photonic light-speed interconnects, or even actual biological wetware, complete in silico simulation remains science fiction. But that leaves us with a truly fascinating, provocative thought to take away. Researchers are increasingly turning to literal biological components, living human neurons, to solve our computational limits. So if the very future of computing requires actual biological wetware to achieve efficiency, then where exactly is the line between a machine and a mind? It really makes you look at your own highly efficient 20-watt biological brain in a whole new light. Thank you so much for exploring this explainer with me, and keep questioning the horizon.